So, checklists, friend or enemy? They can be both a comfort and an awkward nuisance, I think, but it helps to understand their benefit, and that's what I hope to do here. Also, I think just a little background and a history is beneficial. As they say, aviation safety is written in blood. Many, many horrific accidents lead to changes in procedures, techniques, discipline, and regulations. The Boeing Model 299 was a brand new airplane competing for a huge contract with an Army Air Corps chief pilot in the left seat. The idea was to demonstrate the plane's capabilities when compared against a Douglas bomber and a Martin bomber. And they took off with the elevator control lock in place. Douglas won the contract. But Boeing rebounded, and this plane became the B-17 Flying Fortress, of which there were ultimately some 12,000 built, and was considered a key tool in the Allied victory in World War II. The accident investigation concluded that the airplane was too big and complex to rely simply on memory and habit, and so the checklist was born. That's the end of the history lesson. We know that we can prevent errors and accidents, and we know that we can mitigate risks. It works. So what are the risks? Ultimately, the list is a mile long, but if you distill it down, the checklist will prevent you from forgetting something or inadvertently missing or skipping something that should be done. This book was published in 2009, and it's a good read. Not too long and very well written. It's by a surgeon, Atul Gawande, who studies the use of checklists in industry and applies it to the operating room, his industry. He talks extensively of the aviation industry and interviews people. He gets to fly a 777 simulator at United's training center with some simulated emergencies, and then tries to apply that logic to his own business with great success. He provides quantifiable data showing that thousands of lives have been potentially saved and many, many more cases of sepsis, infection, and simple negligence prevented. I'd be curious to read a follow-up to see whether or not these principles are still being applied. Obviously, checklists have evolved. Here are two extremes. Apparently, the B-36 took over an hour to run the before takeoff checklists. I guess that's what happens when you invent an airplane with 12 engines. On the other extreme, we have the mnemonics that people use, cigar or gumps. There's others, of course, lights, camera, action, whatever, and they work if they are used. Here's a pretty long list of different types of checklists. Some of these paper ones at the beginning may look the same but be used differently. And we'll talk a little bit about each one of them. I've also got a few samples of different types of checklists. The trigger and flow is one that often gets people's attention. A trigger is an event that precipitates the start of the flow. This is a concept adopted in the airline industry in the past, say, 5 or 6 years, and there are typically numerous triggers and obviously numerous flows that follow. Before we take a look at this one, just to understand, in the airline world, when you walked into the cockpit, that was the trigger. There is a memorized flow that starts now. The first thing might be to test the electronic locking of the door, then check your shoulder harnesses, yank them up, see if the inertial reel's working properly, then check the fire extinguisher and the crash axe. So that would be the flow, and it's not necessarily followed by a paper checklist, it's just done. Now, I'd be willing to bet that you're already doing something like this when you do the exterior pre-flight. The trigger may be completion of your initial cockpit prep, you close the door and start your flow. Unless you're walking around with a car stuck, you are following a flow around the airplane where you stop and check certain things along your path. You get to the empennage, you check the stabilizer, elevator, trim tab, hinges, linkages, rudder, tail light, and so on. And then you move along the fuselage, checking until you get to the wing where you sump the fuel and so on. So now let's take a look at this flow. Now again, in the airline world, checklists are a religion. And there is so much thought and planning that goes into this that it boggles the mind. So here, the trigger is having the engine started and the flaps are set for takeoff, and now you received your weight and balance information electronically. At that point, but not until that point, each pilot runs his or her flow. And here you can see that the company tells you exactly what to check and in what sequence. And when it's complete, it'll be followed by the before takeoff checklist, which is read out loud. Now, I said the checklists are religion, and here you see that they have it diagrammed. This is the captain's flow, starting with the takeoff data and bugs, and then up to the HUD and over to the generators, air conditioning, pressurization, and down to the flaps and sab trim. And finally, here's the actual checklist, challenge and response checklist that's read by the first officer and responded to by the captain. There's a mutual supervision and cross-checking. There's more to it than it seems when you glance at this. For example, the Cross of Lorraine, that little mark to the right of the word checked, that means that both pilots respond out loud to that item. The blank space requires something to be inserted, for example, 10 degrees. If there's something in all caps, it means that there is a switch with that position labeled on or auto. Now, in this case, on the 737, the before takeoff portion of the paper checklist is only used if the mechanical checklist is inoperative. The next slide shows a mechanical checklist. This is a beautiful, ingenious device invented and designed and built by American Airlines. It has a rheostat on the top, a takeoff, an off, and a landing switch, and a toggle for each item, an annunciator, and a complete light. When all the complete lights are on, the checklist is complete. It can be done in any order, just so long as it's completed before takeoff or before landing. So there you can see that we're starting to work our way through. Stab trim is checked, flaps, auto brakes, set, map display, so on, packs, lights, and then it's complete. So it's not too different. This is an example of an electronic checklist that's not too different from the one on our G3X. You can see that the first two items, oxygen and signs, have been checked by the crew and marked as complete. And then the bottom three items that have been checked are actually done automatically. They look a little bit different. And the system takes advantage of various sensors on the plane, which sense the position of the controls. So you can see that the auto brake has been set to RTO, the brake is on, and the fuel control switches are cut off. They've all turned green with a check mark because of the sensors. This next slide is an example of an automatic spoken checklist. This is from ForeFlight, and there are others. One member was telling me about one that he's trying out. I think it's called Smart Check. I forget, but some people like this, and some members use them. I've tried it myself. It hasn't really hit home with me, but perhaps it will. This functionality exists. Anybody who uses ForeFlight has this functionality, and these incredible tools are guaranteed to mitigate the risk of making mistakes.
Circuit breakers, checked in. Electrical equipment, off. Avionics master, off. Fuel selector, both. Fuel shutoff valve, on, push in. Checklist complete.
The problem is, of course, you have to use these checklists. This pile of metal was a G4, probably an $8 million plane. Both pilots were very familiar with the plane, perhaps too familiar, and they both missed two opportunities to trap this error during the before start checklist and the after start checklist. We don't fly G4s in Blue Sky, but we still have plenty of opportunities to mess up. When you're heading out to your Astrojet, don't let this happen to you. Don't be this guy. Failing to use the checklist is a mistake with a pretty simple solution. So let's take a look at some of the reasons people don't use checklists. Personally, my experience in flying with Blue Sky pilots is that they are generally good about the pre-flight, the before start, the taxi checklist, and the before takeoff checklist. From there, it goes downhill. Why? Well, I don't think people are distracted, and I don't think they're suffering from false perceptions, nor are they in a hurry. So that really only leaves the top reason, attitude or lack of discipline. But that's easy to fix, and I challenge you to try to do it better. These problems are not doing the checklist, but problems with how the checklist is completed. It may seem academic, but I think it helps to take a look at these and see if there's anything that might apply to you. The smoother it goes while using a checklist, the more likely you are to use it. So correcting some of these mistakes can help smooth the process. The next two slides show some best practices that you may be able to adopt. Now, how does this work for us general aviation pilots? Well, we've already established that your exterior pre-flight is one big flow. Think about it. There's nothing stopping you from creating your own other flows to use, mini flows that get backed up with the paper checklist. It's simple. It's just a matter of creating or designing your own flows and then tying them to a trigger, which will help you to remember to do the flow. Checklists should be clear and concise. I think ours are quite readable, and the segmented concept is something that we started with recently. We should have more of that. Could they be better? I think they could, and I have some ideas, but I'm always open to other people's ideas on how to improve them, and we'll talk about that. When I created the first Blue Sky checklist, I was very concerned from a liability standpoint to include the manufacturer's language verbatim. I was concerned that by not doing so, it would be exposing the club to liability. This type of thing has happened at all the major airlines, and eventually they've come around to adopt the manufacturer's language. But still, they have improved on them, and that's what I hope to do here. Here's an example of our segmented checklist. By giving these sections a different background, it helps the brain and reinforces that they are singular tasks with several steps. So, for example, you have the autopilot check and the run-up in gray boxes. And then you have your before lineup items. These are important items that you shouldn't forget for any takeoff, and if you're staying in the pattern, you can just use these items. There will be more changes coming when the Skyhawk comes online with its new avionics, and I want to both harmonize and simplify the steps so that the wording and sequence is identical. So when you switch airplanes, it'll make it more seamless. So back to best practices. As you conduct the checklist, you should use your thumb or finger and slide it down with each item. This way, if you do get interrupted, you can easily go back to where you were. Try to make this a consistent habit. Either that or start over when you get interrupted. Do you use the sterile cockpit concept? That's a good idea. Two other very important techniques. One is to say it out loud. Regardless of how many people are listening, or even when you're flying by yourself, the importance of this cannot be overstated. When you say things out loud, you would reinforce in your mind the completion of the action, like throwing a switch or checking an instrument. And you also reinforce the importance of it. So I strongly recommend talking out loud when flying. 3 quick stories. They're all airline stories, but apply directly to general aviation also. First of all, FOQA. FOQA is an aviation term, an airline term, I should say. It stands for Flight Operations Quality Assurance. And at American Airlines, I can speak to this. When they first got FOQA, probably 15 years ago, they started to monitor the data. And the data is everything that you can imagine that's flowing live from the airplane to a monitoring system on the ground. It's all the flight data, airspeeds, position of switches, and so on and so forth. Gear, flaps, you name it. Angle of attack. And so when Americans first got this, they realized they had this incredible tool, and they started looking at what they can do to help things. One of the first things that they tackled was flap overspeeds. They noticed that people were overspeeding the flaps when they were extending the flaps. And then, once they had this data, they knew that they were overspeeding the flaps. They're required by the FAA to do inspections. And so the inspections are very expensive and time-consuming. They take the airplane out of service, and so they had to fix this. So what did they do? They came up with a new program. Everybody knew that they're not supposed to overspeed the flaps. But now what they did is they changed the procedure. So now when you're flying, before you used to just say flaps 1, flaps 5, flaps 10, whatever the selection was, and the pilot not flying would make that selection. Now what you had to do was say the limiting speed and then the flap selection. So for example, it would be speed below 250, flaps 1. And then the pilot not flying would look over, verify the speed, and select flaps 1, and so on and so forth through each flap selection. Problem solved. They basically solved the problem overnight by forcing the pilot to speak out loud. Next example has to do with unstabilized approaches. They realized that they had a number of cases frequently where pilots were flying unstabilized approaches. And what they did was they changed the procedure. Everybody knew what a stabilized approach was or is. It has a certain number of parameters. At 1,000 feet, you have to be on glide slope, on descent rate, on thrust, with landing configuration, gear, and flaps, and 1,000 feet AGL. And everybody knew what that was, but yet still people were flying unstabilized approaches. They didn't get to that gateway, let's say, until they were 800 or 900 feet AGL. So that technically qualifies as an unstabilized approach. So now what they did was they made the pilots say out loud, stable. At 1,000 AGL, you're required to say stable. And of course, you have to meet all the parameters. Again, problem solved. Just by saying it out loud, you reinforce it in your own mind, your own brain, and on top of that, I think you don't want to lie to your buddy or force the non-flying pilot into sort of looking the other way, so to speak, when you're not stable. The final example of this is the use of the term "my airplane." So they instituted a new procedure when a startling, upsetting event takes place, surprise event takes place, the pilot flying would say, "my airplane." So for example, that might be an engine failure at takeoff decision speed, that might be a wind shear alert, it might be a terrain closure alert, it might be an upset, and one of those things happens, the pilot flying says, "my aircraft." So on first, or "my airplane." So on first blush, you would think, well, it's his airplane to begin with. Why does he have to say this? And honestly, from some of our responses was, well, yeah, it's been your airplane since we took off 8 hours ago in Barcelona. Why do you have to say this? And the thinking behind it, and it works, is that it forces the pilot to remind himself, to reinforce himself that he's in control, and it's basically game on. So I thought those were interesting, and that's enough of those airline stories, but they do apply to us. Here's another very good and very simple technique. When you're done on a page of the folding checklist, fold it and put it back in the holder so that it's ready for the next section when needed. When you pull it out to do the after takeoff checklist, it's already there. No fumbling around for the right checklist. And then do the same thing again. Set it up so that it's ready for the descent checklist or the before landing checklist. You'll discover that if there's less fumbling, there's less frustration. And if there's less frustration, you're more likely to use it. It's simple. So I'd like to hear from you folks too on our checklists. If there are ideas, if you have personal techniques, habits, practices, if you have your own checklist, that's fine too. Or do you use the Blue Sky checklist? Have you developed or used your own flows? Just generally comments and member feedback.